For a long time, the colossal squid did not exist in the way most animals do. There were no clear images, no footage of it moving through its environment, no direct observations of how it behaved or where it lived. Instead, it appeared in pieces, scattered traces that hinted at something large and unfamiliar, moving somewhere far below the surface. It was known before it was ever truly seen, assembled slowly from fragments that surfaced in the least expected places. One of the earliest and most important of those fragments came not from the ocean itself, but from the bodies of animals that hunted within it. Sperm whales, among the deepest diving mammals on Earth, had long been known to carry strange marks across their skin. These scars were not random. They followed patterns, long lines that crossed the head and body, sometimes clustered, sometimes solitary, but always distinct enough to suggest something deliberate. At first, they were simply accepted as the result of encounters in the dark, evidence that whales did not move alone in those depths. But as more whales were studied, and as the marks appeared again and again across individuals separated by vast distances, a quiet question began to take shape. What exactly was leaving these marks behind? The answer did not come from watching the whales alive. It came from what was found inside them after they died. When researchers began examining the stomach contents of sperm whales, they discovered something that did not match any known fish or familiar marine animal. Hard, curved structures, dense and resistant, survived digestion long after softer tissues had been broken down. These were beaks, the mouthparts of squid, but not of any squid that had been observed directly. They were too large, too robust, and shaped in ways that did not align neatly with known species. At first, they were catalogued, measured, and stored, treated as anomalies rather than answers. But over time, as more of these beaks were collected, patterns emerged. The size alone was enough to raise questions. Some of these beaks suggested an animal far larger than anything commonly encountered. Not just longer, but heavier, built differently, with a solidity that implied strength rather than speed. They did not belong to the slender, elongated giant squid that had already begun to enter scientific awareness. These were something else, something denser, something that likely moved through the water with a different kind of presence. Yet at this stage, that presence was entirely inferred. No one had seen the animal itself. All that existed were these hard remains, extracted from the stomachs of predators that could dive deeper than any human had ever been. There is a strange kind of knowledge that comes from this process, one that feels less like observation and more like reconstruction. Scientists were not watching the colossal squid live its life. They were piecing it together after the fact, using whatever evidence survived long enough to be examined. A beak suggested size, a scar suggested shape. The spacing of marks on a whale's skin hinted at the arrangement of limbs. Each fragment offered a small piece of the whole, but never the whole itself. It was like trying to understand an entire animal from the impression it left behind, rather than from the animal itself. This method of knowing is older than modern science. It echoes the way early naturalists understood creatures that were rarely seen, relying on bones, tracks, and stories passed between sailors and fishermen. But in the case of the colossal squid, the process was grounded not in rumour, but in repeated, measurable evidence. The same types of beaks appeared again and again. The same patterns of scarring were observed across different whales. Over time, it became impossible to dismiss these clues as coincidence. Something large and powerful was interacting with sperm whales in the deep ocean, leaving behind consistent signs of its existence. Even then, naming it required a leap. In 1925, based largely on beaks recovered from sperm whale stomachs, the species was formally described. It was given a scientific identity before it was ever seen alive, defined by the fragments it left behind rather than by direct observation. This is unusual, even in marine biology. Most animals are described through physical specimens that can be studied in full, their anatomy examined directly. The colossal squid entered science differently. It was, in a sense, an idea supported by evidence, rather than a fully known organism. That difference shaped how it was understood from the beginning. Without complete specimens, early descriptions had to rely on extrapolation. The size of the beak suggested the size of the body. The curvature and structure hinted at feeding behaviour. Comparisons were made with known squid species, but the differences were just as important as the similarities. Slowly, a picture began to form, not a clear image, but a silhouette, something defined by what it was not as much as by what it might be. At the same time, the scars on sperm whales took on new meaning. What had once been mysterious marks became part of a larger story. They were no longer just evidence of encounters, but potential records of struggle. The spacing of the scars suggested arms or tentacles equipped with something more than simple suction. The depth of the wounds implied force. These were not gentle interactions. They hinted at resistance, at animals meeting in the dark and leaving marks on each other that would last a lifetime. Yet even here, the details remained out of reach. No one had seen such an encounter. There were no recordings, no direct observations, only the aftermath etched into skin and preserved in bone. And this is where the colossal squid began to take on a different kind of presence. It was not just a large animal living in the deep ocean. It was something that existed at the edge of what could be known, defined by absence as much as by evidence. Each new fragment added clarity, but also reinforced the distance between human understanding and the environment where the animal actually lived. The deeper scientists looked, the more they realized how much of this world remained inaccessible. There is a tendency to think of discovery as a moment, a clear point where something unknown becomes known. In reality, it often unfolds gradually, through accumulation rather than revelation. The colossal squid did not emerge fully formed into scientific awareness. It assembled itself piece by piece, each fragment contributing to a larger, incomplete picture. Even today, much of what is known about it still traces back to these indirect sources, to beaks recovered from predators, to marks left behind in encounters that were never witnessed. And in a way, that origin never fully disappears. Even as more specimens are found, even as technology improves and the possibility of direct observation increases, the colossal squid remains tied to this method of discovery. It is an animal that entered human knowledge sideways, through other creatures, through traces and remains rather than through direct experience. That shapes how it is understood. It introduces a layer of uncertainty that is difficult to remove, a reminder that some parts of the natural world reveal themselves only partially, even when we are looking closely. The idea of knowing something through fragments is not comfortable. It leaves space for doubt, for reinterpretation, for the possibility that the picture we have built is incomplete or slightly misaligned. But it is also a powerful way of understanding environments that resist direct observation. In the deep ocean, where light disappears and pressure limits exploration, this kind of knowledge becomes not just useful, but necessary. The colossal squid is one of the clearest examples of this, an animal that has been known for nearly a century and yet remains in many ways just out of reach. And as those early clues began to accumulate, as beaks were measured and scars were mapped, attention slowly shifted outward, away from the fragments themselves and toward the place they came from. Because understanding the animal meant understanding the environment that could hide something so large so completely, an environment that did not easily give up its secrets, and that would shape every aspect of what the colossal squid could be. What those fragments quietly point toward is not just an animal, but a place, a setting so vast and so resistant to observation that even something as large as a colossal squid can pass through it, almost entirely unseen. The clues do not simply describe the creature itself, they trace the outline of the environment that allows it to remain hidden. And that environment begins far from where most people imagine the deep ocean to be, in waters that are not just deep, but cold, in a way that reshapes everything within them. The Southern Ocean, circling Antarctica, is unlike any other on Earth. It is not defined by coastlines in the usual sense, but by a current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. a continuous flow of water that moves endlessly from west to east, unbroken by land. This current isolates the continent in a way that is both physical and ecological. It acts as a barrier, separating the colder, denser waters near Antarctica from the relatively warmer oceans to the north. What results is a system that feels almost self-contained, a vast ring of water that behaves differently from the rest of the planet's oceans. Temperatures here are near freezing for most of the year, hovering just above the point where seawater would begin to solidify. The cold is not seasonal in the way it is elsewhere. It is constant, a defining feature that shapes the chemistry of the water, the behaviour of currents, and the biology of everything that lives within it. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water, allowing certain organisms to grow larger or sustain different metabolic strategies. At the same time, the low temperatures slow biological processes, stretching growth and movement over longer periods. In this environment, speed is rarely an advantage. Efficiency matters more. Beneath the surface, the structure of the water column becomes more complex than a simple descent into darkness. Layers form based on temperature and salinity, creating boundaries that influence how water moves vertically and horizontally. These layers can trap nutrients, guide currents, and even affect how sound travels. For an animal moving through these depths, the ocean is not uniform. It is a shifting architecture of density and pressure, a three-dimensional landscape that changes subtly with depth and location. The Southern Ocean is also deep, but not in a single uniform way. Its seafloor is shaped by ridges, trenches, and basins formed over millions of years by tectonic activity. In some places, the depth drops away gradually. In others, it falls sharply, creating vast regions where sunlight never penetrates and where pressure builds to levels that challenge both life and technology. It is within these deeper zones, often hundreds or even thousands of meters below the surface, that the conditions begin to resemble those inferred from the fragments of the colossal squid. Darkness here is not simply the absence of light, it is a permanent state. Sunlight fades quickly as it passes through water, and by the time a few hundred meters are reached, it has diminished to a faint blue glow. Beyond that, there is nothing. No dawn, no dusk, no variation across the day. The cycle that governs life at the surface disappears entirely. For animals adapted to this environment, vision takes on a different meaning. It is not about seeing landscapes or colours, but about detecting movement, contrast, or the faintest trace of bioluminescence produced by other organisms. This darkness contributes directly to the difficulty of observation. Cameras require light, and light alters behaviour. The very act of trying to see into this environment changes it, often causing animals to retreat or behave differently. Even when technology is capable of reaching these depths, it does not guarantee that what is there will reveal itself. The presence of a submersible or remotely operated vehicle is not neutral. It introduces noise, vibration, and illumination into a system that has evolved without them. Many deep-sea animals are sensitive to these disturbances, moving away long before they can be recorded. Isolation adds another layer to this difficulty. The Southern Ocean is one of the most remote regions on Earth, far from major shipping routes and difficult to access for much of the year due to extreme weather and sea ice. Storms here can be relentless, driven by strong winds that circle the continent with little interruption. Waves build over vast distances, creating conditions that challenge even large research vessels. Deploying equipment into the deep under these circumstances is not only technically demanding, but also limited by time and safety. Expeditions are rare, and each one must be carefully planned, often with only a narrow window in which conditions are favourable enough to operate. Even when those conditions are met, the scale of the environment remains overwhelming. The ocean is not just deep, it is vast in every direction. Searching for a specific animal within it is not like exploring a forest or a reef where life is concentrated and visible. It is closer to searching for a single moving object within a volume that extends for thousands of kilometers. The probability of encountering any particular species at any given moment is extremely low, even if that species is relatively common within its own ecological niche. This is one of the reasons large animals can remain hidden for so long. Size alone does not guarantee visibility. In fact, in the deep ocean, size can be accompanied by behavior that reduces the likelihood of detection. Many large deep-sea animals move slowly, conserving energy in an environment where food is not abundant. They may spend long periods relatively inactive, or drifting or hovering rather than actively swimming. This reduces the chance of creating disturbances that might attract attention. Additionally, some species may occupy depth ranges that are rarely sampled by human technology, either because they're too deep for routine exploration, or because they lie in transitional zones that are difficult to access. The colossal squid, inferred from the evidence found in sperm whales and rare specimens, appears to occupy such a space. It is associated with the cold, deep waters of the Southern Ocean, often linked to depths where both pressure and darkness are extreme. These are regions where few direct observations have been made, and where the combination of environmental factors creates a natural barrier to study. The cold slows processes, the darkness limits vision. The pressure challenges equipment, and the sheer scale ensures that even repeated attempts at observation may yield nothing. There is also a subtle interplay between predator and prey that further obscures the presence of large animals. In ecosystems where food is limited, encounters are infrequent by necessity. Predators cannot afford to expend energy searching constantly, and prey species evolve strategies to avoid detection. This leads to a dynamic where both sides minimize activity, reducing the overall visibility of the system. Evidence of interaction, such as scars or stomach contents, becomes more common than direct observation of the interactions themselves. In this sense, the Southern Ocean does not simply hide the colossal squid by accident. It provides the exact conditions under which an animal can exist at a large scale while remaining largely unseen. The environment does not need to conceal it actively. The combination of depth, darkness, cold, and isolation does that naturally. What appears as mystery from the surface is, from within the system, simply the normal state of things. And as the focus shifts from the fragments that first reveal the squid to the environment that sustains it, the question begins to change. It is no longer just about what the animal is, but about how such an animal can exist in a place that resists observation so completely, and what that reveals about the limits of what we are able to see and understand. And within that environment where visibility is already so limited and encounters so rare, another layer of confusion begins to take shape. Not in the water itself, but in the way we try to imagine what lives there. For a long time, the idea of a massive squid lurking in the deep was dominated by a single image, something long, serpentine with trailing tentacles stretching into darkness, a creature that seemed almost mythological in proportion. That image largely came from what we now call the giant squid, a species that has been known to science for much longer and has had just enough encounters with humans to shape a kind of collective expectation. But the animal suggested by those beaks in whale stomachs and the scars etched into living skin does not fully match that expectation. And the difference between the two is not a matter of small details, but of fundamental design. The giant squid, Architeuthis, is built around length. Its body is elongated, with two extremely long feeding tentacles that can extend far beyond the rest of its form, giving it an overall reach that can be astonishing when fully extended. Much of its size is visual, a matter of extension rather than mass. In contrast, the colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, is something else entirely. It is shorter in total length when measured from tip to tip, but far heavier, more compact, and built in a way that suggests a different relationship with its environment. Where the giant squid stretches outward, the colossal squid gathers inward, concentrating its mass into a body that is thicker, denser, and more muscular. And this difference in construction is not just anatomical, it reflects a different strategy for survival in the deep. Weight in the ocean is not the same as weight on land, but it still matters in terms of energy, movement, and interaction with other organisms. A heavier, more solid body allows for bursts of strength, for resisting pressure, for maintaining position in a column of water that is constantly in motion. It suggests an animal that does not rely on long-distance extension to capture prey, but on controlled, powerful movements within a closer range. The colossal squid's arms and tentacles are shorter relative to its body, but they are equipped with something the giant squid does not possess in the same way: swiveling hooks. These are not simple suction cups. They are hardened, curved structures that can rotate, allowing them to embed and hold onto prey with a grip that is both mechanical and adaptable. In an environment where prey may be scarce and encounters infrequent, the ability to secure what is caught becomes critical. A missed opportunity might not be easily replaced. These hooks suggest a predator that cannot afford to let go once contact is made. Even the eyes, often cited as among the largest in the animal kingdom, take on a different meaning when considered in this context. Both giant and colossal squids have enormous eyes, an adaptation to the darkness of the deep, but the scale and structure in the colossal squid point toward a specific purpose. In the depths of the Southern Ocean, where light is almost entirely absent, the most significant visual cues may come not from sunlight but from bioluminescence, or from the disturbance of other large animals moving through the water. A large eye can detect faint changes in light, subtle contrasts that might indicate the presence of a predator or prey. For an animal living in a space where encounters are rare but consequential, the ability to detect something at the edge of perception can mean the difference between feeding and being fed upon. This brings another misconception into focus, one that is rooted in the way these animals are often described. The giant squid has long been portrayed as a kind of elusive wanderer, a creature of legend that drifts through the deep, occasionally rising into shallower waters where it might be glimpsed or stranded. The colossal squid, by contrast, yet appears to be more firmly tied to its environment, more specialised, and perhaps less inclined to move across large vertical ranges. Its physiology suggests adaptation to the cold, high-pressure waters of the Southern Ocean's depths, rather than a broader distribution. This specialisation may be one of the reasons it is so rarely seen. It does not simply pass through areas where humans are more likely to encounter it. It remains within a narrower, more inaccessible zone. There is also the matter of how these animals interact with their primary known predator, the sperm whale. The scars found on whales have often been attributed broadly to giant squids, but closer examination indicates that many of these marks are more consistent with the hooks of the colossal squid. This distinction matters because it suggests that the encounters between whale and squid are not just incidental, but may involve a predator that is particularly well equipped to defend itself. A colossal squid is not just large, it is armed in a way that can leave lasting damage on an animal as powerful as a sperm whale. This does not mean it wins such encounters, but it does mean that it is not a passive participant. It is capable of resistance, of inflicting injury, of shaping the outcome in ways that go beyond simply being captured. The idea that all large squids are variations of the same basic form begins to break down under this scrutiny. What emerges instead is a picture of diversity within a group that is often simplified in popular imagination. The colossal squid is not simply a bigger or rarer version of the giant squid. It represents a different solution to the challenges of life in the deep ocean, one that emphasizes strength, grip, and resilience over reach and extension. Even the way its body is composed reflects this. The mantle, the main body of the squid, is thicker and more robust, capable of housing powerful muscles and supporting a structure that must function under immense pressure. The fins, used for movement and stability, are proportionally different, suggesting a style of locomotion that is less about rapid, long-distance travel and more about controlled positioning within a specific depth range. All of these features point toward an animal that is not built to wander widely, but to exist effectively within a defined space, responding to opportunities as they arise rather than seeking them out over large distances. This reframing also changes how we think about rarity. The colossal squid is often described as elusive or mysterious because it is rarely seen, but that rarity may be more about our perspective than about the animal itself. In its own environment, it may not be particularly rare at all. It may exist in numbers that are sufficient to sustain a stable population, interacting with other species in ways that are simply hidden from us by the conditions of the deep ocean. The misconception arises because we are comparing it to animals that inhabit more accessible environments, where observation is easier and encounters more frequent. When placed within the context of the Southern Ocean's depths, the idea of an unseen but present predator becomes less surprising. It becomes an expected part of a system that operates largely out of sight. And as these distinctions become clearer, the image of the colossal squid begins to shift away from the familiar silhouette of a long, drifting giant and towards something more compact, more deliberate, and in many ways more formidable, an animal whose design is tightly aligned with the environment that conceals it, and whose differences from its more famous relative reveal just how much variation can exist within a world that we have only begun to understand. What begins to emerge from that difference is not just a contrast in appearance, but a deeper shift in how the animal exists moment to moment, because everything about the colossal squid points toward a life shaped less by pursuit and more by endurance, less by speed and more by control. In the deep ocean, especially in the cold, dense waters of the Southern Ocean, speed is not always the advantage it appears to be in shallower, warmer seas. Water at those depths is heavier, more resistant, and the energy required to move quickly through it increases in ways that are not immediately obvious. For an animal of significant size, every burst of motion carries a cost, and in an environment where food is not guaranteed, that cost must be carefully managed. The colossal squid's body reflects this constraint in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if evolution has stripped away anything unnecessary and reinforced only what can be sustained over time. The mantle, which forms the main body of the squid, is thicker and more compact than that of many other cephalopods, not elongated for rapid propulsion but structured to hold mass and maintain internal stability under immense pressure. At depths where the colossal squid is believed to live, pressure can exceed hundreds of atmospheres, a force that would collapse air-filled spaces and strain less robust tissues. The squid's body avoids this vulnerability by relying on a composition that is largely incompressible, with tissues that can withstand the surrounding force without needing to resist it in the way rigid structures do. This is not a body built to fight the ocean, but one designed to exist within it, to yield where necessary and hold where it matters. Movement in this context becomes something measured rather than impulsive. Instead of rapid, continuous swimming, the colossal squid likely uses a combination of gentle fin movements and occasional jet propulsion, conserving energy wherever possible. The fins positioned at the rear of the mantle are not large or designed for speed, but they provide subtle control, allowing the animal to adjust its position in the water column without expending excessive energy. Jet propulsion, which involves expelling water through a siphon to create thrust, is still available, but it is likely used sparingly, perhaps in moments of necessity rather than as a primary mode of travel. This approach aligns with what is observed in many deep-sea organisms, where energy efficiency is not just advantageous but essential. Every calorie consumed must be stretched as far as possible, and unnecessary movement becomes a liability rather than a benefit. The arms and tentacles of the colossal squid reinforce this idea of controlled interaction with the environment. Where the giant squid relies heavily on suction cups to grasp and hold prey, the colossal squid introduces a different mechanism entirely, one that feels more final, more decisive. The swiveling hooks embedded in its limbs are not passive structures. They can rotate, orienting themselves to maximize grip once contact is made. This means that when the squid captures something, it does not need to rely on continuous muscular effort to maintain its hold. The hooks do part of the work, reducing the energy required to secure prey and increasing the likelihood that an encounter will result in a successful capture. In a world where encounters may be rare, this efficiency is critical. It suggests a predator that does not chase often, but when it does engage, it is equipped to ensure that the effort is not wasted. Even the texture and density of the squid's body contribute to this overall design. A denser body can help with neutral buoyancy, allowing the animal to remain suspended in the water column with minimal effort. Achieving this balance is not simple, as it requires a precise relationship between body composition and the surrounding water. Too dense, and the animal sinks, requiring constant energy to maintain position. Too light, and it rises, again demanding correction. The colossal squid appears to occupy a narrow range where it can remain relatively stable, drifting or hovering without significant expenditure. This stability would be particularly useful in an environment where prey might pass by rather than be actively pursued, allowing the squid to remain in place and react when an opportunity arises. The cold of the Southern Ocean adds another layer to this design. Low temperatures slow metabolic processes, reducing the rate at which energy is consumed but also limiting the speed at which it can be generated. For an animal living in such conditions, a high-energy, high-speed lifestyle would be difficult to sustain. Instead, the colossal squid's physiology seems tuned to operate within these constraints, with a metabolism that supports slow, deliberate movement and long periods of relative inactivity. This does not mean the animal is passive or sluggish in the sense of being incapable of rapid action, but rather that it reserves such action for specific moments, maintaining a baseline of minimal energy use for most of its existence. The concept of pressure extends beyond the physical and into the ecological as well. In the deep ocean, pressure shapes not only bodies but behaviours, influencing how animals interact with each other and with their environment. The colossal squid's design suggests an evolutionary history in which surviving the constant force of the surrounding water was as important as capturing food or avoiding predators. Over time, traits that supported this stability would have been favoured, leading to an organism that is in many ways an expression of its environment's demands. It is not streamlined for speed because speed is not the primary currency of its world. Instead, it is structured for persistence, for maintaining form and function under conditions that would challenge less specialised organisms. This perspective also helps explain why the colossal squid remains so difficult to observe. An animal that moves slowly, conserves energy, and exists in a narrow, deep range is inherently less likely to encounter the tools and technologies we use to explore the ocean. It does not rise frequently into shallower waters, it does not engage in behaviours that bring it into contact with the surface, and it does not expend energy on unnecessary movement that might increase its visibility. Its very design contributes to its invisibility, not through active concealment, but through a way of living that minimises interaction with anything outside its immediate environment. In this sense, the colossal squid is not hiding in the way we might imagine, darting away from approaching lights or retreating into darkness. It is simply existing in a manner that rarely intersects with our attempts to find it. Evolution, in this case, has not produced a creature that avoids us specifically, but one that operates so efficiently within its own niche that our presence is almost irrelevant to it. The hooks, the dense mantle, the controlled movement, and the energy-efficient physiology all come together to form an animal that is less about dramatic displays of speed or size and more about a quiet mastery of its environment, yet a mastery that is easy to overlook precisely because it does not announce itself. And as these features are considered together, the image of the colossal squid becomes less about a single striking trait and more about a cohesive system, a set of adaptations that only fully make sense when viewed through the lens of the deep ocean's constraints, where pressure, cold, and scarcity have shaped a predator that is as much a product of endurance as it is of power. And in a body so carefully tuned to conserve energy and withstand pressure, the eye stands out as something almost extravagant, an organ that seems oversized even by the already unusual standards of deep-sea life, yet its scale only makes sense when placed into the visual world the colossal squid inhabits, a world that is not simply dark, but defined by the near-total absence of sunlight and the subtle presence of other forms of illumination that most surface-dwelling creatures never encounter. The eyes of the colossal squid are among the largest known in the animal kingdom, reaching sizes comparable to dinner plates, and this is not a matter of excess but of necessity. Because in the deep ocean, vision is less about seeing clearly and more about detecting the faintest possible signals before they disappear. At depths where sunlight has long since been absorbed by the water above, the only remaining light comes from bioluminescence and the occasional intrusion of distant filtered glow, and even these sources are often weak, scattered, and brief. In such an environment, the ability to gather as much light as possible becomes critical, and the simplest way to do that is to increase the size of the eye itself. A larger eye can capture more photons, increasing sensitivity and allowing the animal to perceive changes that would otherwise be invisible. But sensitivity alone is not the full story, because what the colossal squid needs to detect is not static light, but movement, subtle shifts in brightness that indicate something passing through the water. A distant organism might produce a faint glow, or a disturbance might cause other creatures to emit brief flashes of light as part of their own defensive responses. The squid's eyes are likely tuned to recognize these patterns, to distinguish between the constant background and the transient signals that suggest something alive is nearby. This becomes particularly important when considering one of the squid's primary predators, the sperm whale. Unlike many deep-sea creatures, the sperm whale is large, powerful, and capable of moving through the water with significant force, displacing volumes of water and triggering reactions from smaller organisms along its path. As it dives into the depths, it creates a kind of moving disturbance, a chain of subtle events that can propagate outward. Tiny bioluminescent organisms may flash in response to the turbulence, creating a faint, expanding pattern of light that marks the whale's approach. For an animal equipped with sufficiently sensitive vision, this pattern can be detected at a distance, providing a crucial early warning. The colossal squid's eyes, with their immense size, may be specifically adapted to pick up on these kinds of large-scale disturbances, allowing it to sense the presence of a predator long before direct contact becomes inevitable. This shifts the role of vision from simply locating prey to navigating risk, to understanding the dynamics of a space where direct sight is rarely possible, but indirect cues can be everything. At the same time, those same eyes would be used to detect potential prey, which in the deep ocean often relies on bioluminescence for communication, camouflage, or attraction. Small fish, crustaceans, and other organisms may produce light in specific patterns, whether to signal to others of their kind or to confuse predators. For the colossal squid, these signals become points of interest, brief flickers in an otherwise uniform darkness that indicate the presence of something worth investigating. The challenge is not just to see these signals, but to interpret them, to differentiate between background noise and meaningful information. Over evolutionary time, the squid's visual system would have been shaped by these demands, favouring those individuals that could respond appropriately to the subtle language of light in the deep sea. The structure of the eye itself reflects this specialisation. Large lenses allow more light to enter, while the internal arrangement of photoreceptor cells is likely optimised for low light conditions, prioritising sensitivity over resolution. In such an environment, seeing a detailed image is less important than detecting the presence and movement of objects. The world is not experienced in sharp outlines, but in gradients, in the shifting contrast between slightly brighter and slightly darker regions. This kind of vision may seem limited from a human perspective, but it is precisely what is needed in a place where clarity is impossible and awareness is everything. There is also a temporal aspect to this vision, a sensitivity to change over time rather than to fixed images, A sudden flash, a slow dimming, a ripple of light moving through the water, these are the cues that matter. The colossal squid's brain, in processing the input from such large eyes, would be attuned to these temporal patterns, allowing it to respond to events as they unfold rather than relying on static snapshots of its surroundings. This dynamic perception aligns with the overall design of the animal, which is built not for constant motion but for readiness, for the ability to act decisively when a meaningful signal appears. Even the positioning of the eyes on the squid's body plays a role in how it perceives its environment. Placed to provide a wide field of view, they allow the animal to monitor a large volume of surrounding water, increasing the likelihood of detecting distant signals. In a space where threats and opportunities can come from any direction, this broad awareness is essential. It reduces blind spots and ensures that the squid is not reliant on turning or repositioning itself to gather information, thus actions that would consume energy and potentially reveal its presence. The idea of what the colossal squid sees is therefore quite different from the way we typically imagine vision. It is not a world of detailed landscapes or clearly defined objects, but one of intermittent signals, of faint glows and moving shadows that hint at the presence of other life. It is a world where absence is the default and presence is marked by subtle deviations from that absence. In such a context, the enormous eyes are not an extravagance but a necessity, an adaptation that allows the squid to exist within a sensory framework that would otherwise be almost entirely inaccessible. And when considered alongside the rest of its physiology, the eyes complete a picture of an animal that is deeply integrated with its environment, one that relies on the smallest available cues to navigate a space that remains largely invisible, even to us, and whose perception of that space is built not on what is clearly seen, but on what can just barely be detected at the edge of darkness. And yet, for all the ways the colossal squid senses its world, for all the subtle signals it can detect at the edge of darkness, the moments where its existence becomes undeniable to us do not come from direct observation, but from the aftermath of encounters far more violent than anything we have ever witnessed firsthand, because the only clear interactions we can study are written onto the bodies of another deep-diving giant, the sperm whale, an animal that descends into the same cold depths, not as a passive observer, but as an active hunter. When a sperm whale returns to the surface, it sometimes carries with it a record of what happened below, a record etched into its skin in the form of long circular scars that trace patterns unlike anything produced by teeth or claws we're more familiar with. These scars are not random. They appear in repeated arrangements, often lining the whale's head and body, forming rows of marks that match the spacing and structure of a squid's arms and tentacles. For a long time, these markings were attributed broadly to giant squids, but as understanding deepened and more detailed comparisons were made, it became clear that many of these scars bear the distinct signature of something else, something equipped not just with suction cups, but with rotating hooks capable of cutting into thick skin. The pattern of damage aligns more closely with what we now know of the colossal squid, suggesting that these encounters are not incidental, but part of an ongoing interaction between two of the ocean's most formidable deep-sea inhabitants. What makes these encounters particularly compelling is that they occur entirely out of sight, yet far below the reach of sunlight and beyond the limits of most observation technology. The whale dives, the squid responds, and whatever struggle unfolds happens in complete darkness, leaving no direct record except what can be inferred afterward. This forces us into a different kind of understanding, one that relies on reconstruction rather than observation, piecing together fragments of evidence to form a picture of events that no human has ever seen. The scars tell part of the story. They indicate that the squid is not simply captured without resistance, but that it fights, using its hooks to grip and tear, leaving marks that can persist for years on the whale's body. The distribution of these scars suggests that the squid often targets the whale's head, perhaps in an attempt to reach sensitive areas or to disrupt the whale's ability to continue its attack. This is not a passive defense, but an active engagement, a struggle in which both animals bring their full capabilities to bear. Inside the whale, another layer of evidence accumulates. The beaks of squids, made of a tough chitinous material, are resistant to digestion and can remain intact even after the rest of the animal has been broken down. Over time, these beaks can collect in the stomach of the whale, providing a record of its diet and, by extension, of the species it encounters in the deep. Among these remains, scientists have identified beaks that match the colossal squid, confirming that it is indeed part of the whale's prey. The size and structure of these beaks offer clues about the size of the squid itself, allowing estimates to be made even in the absence of a complete specimen. It is through these indirect means that much of what we know about the colossal squid has been established, not through direct capture or observation, but through the remains it leaves behind in the bodies of its predators. The relationship between sperm whale and colossal squid is not one of simple dominance, even if the whale ultimately consumes the squid. It is a dynamic interaction shaped by the capabilities of both animals. The whale, with its ability to dive to great depths, navigate using echolocation, and exert immense force, is well equipped to locate and capture large prey. Its echolocation clicks can penetrate the darkness, providing a kind of acoustic image of the surrounding environment, allowing it to detect the presence of a squid even when no light is available. Once it closes the distance, the whale's size and strength give it a significant advantage. But the squid is not defenseless. Its hooks, its muscular body, and its ability to maneuver within the water all contribute to a resistance that is strong enough to leave lasting marks. The scars on whales are evidence that these encounters are not always clean or easy, that the process of capturing such a prey involves risk and effort. There is also the question of how often these encounters occur and what they mean for both species. The presence of numerous squid beaks in a whale's stomach suggests that these interactions are not rare, at least not from the whale's perspective. For the whale, the deep ocean is a hunting ground, and the colossal squid is one of several large prey items it may pursue. For the squid, however, each encounter with a whale represents a significant threat, a moment where its survival is directly challenged. This asymmetry shapes the behaviour of both animals. The whale seeks out the squid as a source of food, while the squid must balance the need to feed with the need to avoid becoming prey. The result is a kind of ongoing, unseen contest, played out in a space that remains largely inaccessible to us. Reconstructing these encounters requires not just the examination of physical evidence, but also an understanding of the behaviours and capabilities of both animals. Scientists must consider how a whale approaches its prey, how a squid might respond, and what sequence of events could produce the patterns observed on the whale's skin. This involves combining data from different sources, including anatomical studies, observations of related species, and models of deep-sea behaviour. It is a process that blends biology with inference, building a narrative that is supported by evidence but not directly observed. In this way, the battles between sperm whales and colossal squids become one of the few windows we have into the life of an animal that otherwise remains hidden. They provide a context in which the squid's adaptations can be understood not just as abstract features, but as tools used in real interactions, with real consequences. The hooks are no longer just anatomical curiosities, they're weapons that leave marks. The dense body is not just a structural feature, it is something that can resist and respond under pressure. The large eyes are not just for sensing distant light, they may play a role in detecting the approach of a predator before the encounter begins. All of these elements come together in these unseen confrontations, shaping outcomes that we can only partially reconstruct. And in relying on these fragments, these scars and remnants, we're reminded that much of the deep ocean's reality exists beyond direct human experience, accessible only through the traces it leaves behind, traces that hint at interactions far more complex and intense than anything we have yet been able to observe directly. And from those encounters that leave only scars and indigestible remains, there are, on very rare occasions, moments where something far more tangible rises out of the deep, not because it intended to, but because it was pulled there by forces it never evolved to encounter. And it is in these moments that the colossal squid briefly crosses into our world in a form we can finally examine directly, though even then the encounter is incomplete, shaped by accident rather than intention. Most of the specimens we have ever studied did not come from deliberate exploration or carefully planned expeditions, but from fishing vessels operating in the Southern Ocean, vessels that lower lines and nets into depths where the boundaries between target species and everything else begin to blur. Long lines set for species like Patagonian toothfish extend into the same cold, dark layers where the colossal squid lives, and occasionally something far larger and entirely unexpected becomes entangled. When that happens, the squid is brought upward through a water column. It is not built to traverse, moving from immense pressure to comparatively low pressure in a short span of time, a transition that places extreme stress on its body. By the time it reaches the surface, it is often already dead or in a condition that reflects the trauma of the ascent, its tissues damaged, its form altered in ways that complicate the process of understanding what it was in life. And yet, even in that state, these specimens represent something extraordinary, because they are among the only opportunities scientists have to study the colossal squid as a complete organism rather than as fragments. One of the most well-known examples of this occurred in 2007, when a fishing vessel operating in Antarctic waters hauled up a colossal squid that had become hooked while feeding on a fish already caught on the line. The squid, estimated to weigh around 450 kilograms, was one of the most intact specimens ever recovered, and it was eventually transported to New Zealand, where it was preserved and later studied at the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa. For the first time, researchers had access to a nearly complete individual, allowing them to examine features that had previously been inferred only from partial remains. The process of studying such a specimen is both meticulous and limited, because while it provides valuable information about anatomy, it cannot fully reveal behaviour, movement, or the subtle interactions that define the animal's life in the deep. The eyes, for example, can be measured and dissected, revealing their size and internal structure, but the way they function in the living animal, how they respond to faint light, how they integrate with the squid's nervous system, remains something that must still be inferred. Similarly, the hooks on the arms can be examined in detail, their shape, curvature, and attachment studied, but the precise way they are used in a live encounter, the force they can exert, the coordination between limbs, is something that cannot be directly observed from a preserved specimen. This creates a kind of partial knowledge, where the physical form is known, but the living reality remains just out of reach. Even the process of preserving and displaying such a specimen introduces its own challenges. The colossal squid recovered in 2007 had to be kept frozen for an extended period before it could be properly thawed and studied, a process that required careful control to prevent further damage. When it was eventually displayed, it offered the public a rare glimpse of an animal that had previously existed almost entirely in the realm of speculation and indirect evidence. People could see its size, its proportions, the thickness of its mantle, the arrangement of its arms and tentacles, and the formidable hooks that had once engaged in unseen battles with predators. But even in that moment of visibility, the squid remained, in a sense, out of context. Removed from the environment that shaped it, and from the conditions that define its existence. It was present, but not fully representative of what it is in life. Other specimens have been recovered over the years, but most are less complete, often damaged by the process of capture or by the conditions of the deep itself. Sometimes only parts are retrieved, a section of mantle, a cluster of arms, or a beak that can be matched to known species. Each of these finds adds a piece to the puzzle, contributing to a growing but still incomplete picture. Scientists compile measurements, compare structures, and refine their understanding, but always with the awareness that the data comes from moments that are rare, and often unrepeatable. There is no steady stream of observations, always no opportunity to watch these animals in their natural state over extended periods. Instead, knowledge accumulates slowly, built from isolated events that happen without warning. This reliance on rare events shapes the entire field of study around the colossal squid. Research is not driven by continuous observation, but by the careful analysis of whatever evidence becomes available. When a specimen is found, it is studied intensively, because there is no guarantee of when or if another will appear. This creates a sense of urgency, but also a need for caution, because each specimen must be interpreted correctly, its features understood in a way that can be integrated with existing knowledge. Mistakes or misinterpretations can persist for years, influencing how future findings are viewed. The rarity of these specimens also highlights how much remains unknown. For all the measurements and dissections, there are still fundamental questions about the colossal squid that have not been answered. How does it reproduce? How long does it live? How often does it encounter other members of its species? What is the full range of its behaviour in the deep ocean? These questions cannot be resolved through the study of preserved specimens alone. They require observation of living animals in their natural environment, something that has proven extraordinarily difficult. And so, the specimens that do exist occupy a unique place in our understanding. They are both invaluable and insufficient, providing clarity in some areas while leaving others untouched. They confirm that the animal is real, that its size and structure are as extraordinary as suggested by indirect evidence, but they also reinforce the limits of our knowledge, reminding us that what we see on the surface is only a fraction of a much larger, largely hidden reality. Each specimen is a moment where the deep ocean briefly yields something to us, not as a complete revelation but as a fragment, a piece of a story that continues to unfold mostly out of sight, shaped by conditions we can only partially replicate and behaviours we have yet to fully witness. And when those rare specimens are finally laid out under controlled light, measured, photographed, and slowly understood piece by piece, they carry with them an unspoken question that never fully resolves, because even in their presence, something essential is still missing. The simple fact that we almost never see this animal alive in the place where it actually belongs, moving through the environment that shaped every part of its body. The absence is not accidental, and it is not the result of a single limitation, but of several layers of separation that exist between us and the depths where the colossal squid lives. Layers that begin with something as fundamental as pressure. At the depths of the Southern Ocean, where this animal is believed to spend most of its life, pressure is not just a condition, it is a defining force, increasing by roughly 1 atmosphere every 10 meters, until it reaches levels that would instantly crush unprotected equipment and collapse any structure not specifically engineered to withstand it. For a living organism, surviving under such conditions requires a body that does not resist pressure in the way rigid systems do, but accommodates it, allowing internal and external forces to balance. The colossal squid exists within this equilibrium, its tissues structured in a way that makes sense only under those conditions. When we attempt to enter that environment with cameras, submersibles, or remotely operated vehicles, we're not simply observing from a distance. We're introducing objects that must fight against the very forces the squid has adapted to live within. This creates a technological barrier that is difficult to overcome, because the equipment needed to survive at those depths is complex, limited in mobility, and often intrusive in ways that the environment does not naturally accommodate. Even when we do reach the appropriate depth, another problem emerges, one that is less obvious but just as significant: the sheer scale of the ocean itself. The deep sea is not a confined space where animals can be easily located once the correct depth is reached. It is vast beyond intuitive understanding, a three-dimensional expanse where even large creatures can exist without ever encountering one another for extended periods. Searching for a colossal squid in this environment is not like scanning a landscape where objects stand out against a background, but more like trying to find a single moving presence within an almost featureless volume. that extends for thousands of kilometres in every direction. The squid's size, impressive as it is, becomes relative in such a context, because what appears enormous when brought to the surface becomes proportionally small when set against the immensity of its habitat. This scale alone would make encounters rare, even if the squid were actively moving and highly visible, but it is neither of those things in the way we might expect. The limitations of our cameras add another layer to this challenge. Light behaves differently in water, and in the deep ocean, it is almost entirely absent. To capture images, we must bring our own light, and that light, no matter how carefully controlled, introduces an artificial element into an environment that has evolved without it. For many deep-sea organisms, sudden illumination is not neutral. It can trigger responses, cause retreat, or simply fall outside the range of what the animal is adapted to perceive. The colossal squid, with its highly sensitive eyes, may be particularly affected by such intrusions. A bright light in an otherwise dark environment is not just a tool for observation, it is a disturbance, something that alters the conditions we are trying to study. As a result, even when cameras are placed at the correct depth, they may fail to capture the natural behaviour of the animals present, or may miss them entirely if those animals avoid or move away from the illuminated area. The field of view of these cameras is also limited, often capturing only a small portion of the surrounding space at any given time, which means that even if a squid passes nearby, it may not enter the frame. There is also the question of behaviour, something that remains largely inferred but is likely critical in understanding why the colossal squid is so rarely observed. Everything about its physiology suggests an animal that does not move unnecessarily, that conserves energy and interacts with its environment in a measured way. This implies that it is not constantly traversing large distances or engaging in behaviours that would increase the likelihood of encountering foreign objects. Instead, it may remain within a relatively stable range, responding to the presence of prey or predators as needed, but otherwise maintaining a low profile. In such a behavioural framework, the chance of intersecting with a camera or submersible becomes even smaller, because the squid is not actively exploring the environment in a way that would bring it into contact with these devices. It is existing within a space that is already sufficient for its needs, reducing the likelihood of incidental encounters. Some researchers have also considered the possibility that the colossal squid may be capable of detecting the presence of large, unfamiliar objects in the water, whether through subtle changes in pressure, water movement, or even the faint sounds produced by mechanical systems. If this is the case, then the squid may not simply be passively absent from our observations, but actively avoiding situations that deviate from the normal conditions of its environment. This avoidance would not need to be highly sophisticated to be effective. In a space where encounters are already rare, even a slight tendency to move away from disturbances could significantly reduce the probability of being observed. Combined with the limitations of our technology, this creates a situation where the squid remains effectively invisible, not because it is trying to hide in the way we might imagine, but because its way of living does not intersect easily with the methods we use to find it. There have been occasional attempts to design observation strategies that minimize these disturbances, using low-light cameras, baited systems, or passive recording devices that can remain in place for extended periods. These approaches have had some success in capturing images of other deep-sea species, but the colossal squid has remained elusive even in these contexts. This suggests that its rarity in observations is not due to a single factor, but to a combination of depth, scale, behaviour, and technological limitation that together create a barrier that is difficult to overcome. It is not that we have never looked in the right place, but that the right place is vast, the conditions are extreme, and the animal itself is adapted in ways that make it unlikely to be encountered by chance. And so, the absence of live observations becomes part of the story itself, not as a failure of exploration, but as an indication of how effectively the colossal squid fits within its environment, existing in a way that rarely overlaps with our attempts to observe it, leaving us with fragments, rare specimens, and indirect evidence, all pointing toward a presence that is undeniable yet almost never directly seen. After decades of reconstructing its existence from scars carved into whale skin and fragments recovered from stomachs, the moment a living colossal squid finally appeared on camera did not feel like the unveiling of a monster, but the quiet correction of a long-held misunderstanding. The footage did not show a giant dominating the darkness. It showed something smaller, younger, and almost impossibly delicate, drifting in a part of the ocean where even light itself feels like a distant memory. The encounter happened in the Southern Ocean, a place already established as one of the most remote and least forgiving environments on Earth, at a depth where the last traces of daylight have long since faded into a dim blue haze before giving way to near total darkness. This was not the crushing abyss where adults are expected to dominate, but a slightly shallower zone where juveniles pass through a different stage of life, suspended between vulnerability and the slow process of becoming something far more formidable. What the camera captured was a juvenile colossal squid, and its appearance challenged almost every expectation built over decades of speculation. Its body was partially transparent, not in the dramatic sense of invisibility, but enough that faint internal shapes could be seen beneath its surface, as if the animal itself had not yet fully committed to a solid form. There was no heavy, muscular thickness like the preserved specimen suggested. Instead, the mantle appeared soft, lightly structured, and flexible, designed less for brute strength and more for quiet survival in a world where energy is scarce and movement must be carefully controlled. The arms extended outward with a kind of cautious grace, each one moving independently yet remaining subtly coordinated, responding not just to intention, but to the surrounding water itself. Small hooks, the defining feature that would later become instruments of power, were already present, but they did not look like weapons here. They looked proportionally too large for the animal's body, almost as if it were still growing into them, an unfinished design that would only make sense at a larger scale. The fins along the mantle moved gently, not pushing the squid forward with speed, but stabilizing it, allowing it to hover with minimal effort. Everything about its movement suggested efficiency, a careful balance between control and conservation, where every motion had a purpose and nothing was wasted. There was no sudden darting, used no aggressive display, no indication of the kind of violent encounters that must eventually define its adult life. Instead, it drifted, existing more than acting, its presence in the frame almost hesitant, as if it were just passing through rather than inhabiting the space. The eyes, though not yet at their full extraordinary size, were already striking. They reflected what little light the camera provided, giving the impression of awareness without revealing intention. In an environment where vision is one of the few reliable ways to detect danger, even at this stage the eyes hinted at what they would become. Organs capable of detecting the faintest disturbances in the dark, tuned not to detail, but to contrast and movement. The scene itself added another layer to the encounter. The water was not empty, as it might appear at first glance. Fine particles drifted slowly, catching the light in brief scattered flashes, creating a sense of depth that extended far beyond what the camera could capture. The squid moved within this space as if it belonged to it completely, neither disturbed nor particularly interested in the presence of the observing machine. This indifference may be one of the most important details. Unlike many animals that react to light or movement, there was no clear sign that the squid recognized the camera as a threat. It neither fled nor approached with curiosity. It simply continued existing in the same slow, measured way, suggesting that encounters like this are so rare that there has been no evolutionary pressure to develop a response. The contrast between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. Yeah, for years, the colossal squid had been imagined as a deep-sea giant defined by size and power, a hidden counterpart to the sperm whale, locked in unseen battles in the darkness. Yet the first living image revealed a different truth. The life of this animal does not begin as something powerful. It begins as something fragile, almost vulnerable, navigating a world where survival depends not on dominance, but on avoiding attention altogether. This changes how the entire species must be understood. The adult, with its immense mass and formidable hooks, is not the starting point, but the end result of a long and uncertain process. At this stage, the squid is part of a completely different story, one where it is just another organism trying to move unnoticed through a vast and indifferent environment. The location of the sighting reinforces this idea. The Southern Ocean is not just remote in distance, but in accessibility. The conditions make sustained observation extremely difficult. Temperatures hover near freezing, pressure increases steadily with depth, and the sheer scale of the region means that even targeted exploration covers only a fraction of what exists. Cameras must be lowered carefully, often for limited periods, and the chances of encountering a specific species are incredibly small. That this moment was captured at all is less a result of precise tracking, and more a rare intersection of presence and timing. The squid did not appear because it was being searched for. It appeared because for a brief moment, human technology occupied the same space as a life that spends most of its existence beyond reach. This also explains why the animal looked so calm. It was not hiding or escaping because in its world, there was nothing to hide from in that moment. The usual threats, larger predators, sudden disturbances, were absent, leaving it suspended in a temporary state of neutrality. Observing this changes the way its future behaviour is imagined. The aggression associated with adult individuals is not a constant state, but something that emerges under specific conditions. What we see here is the baseline, the default existence of the species, when it is not engaged in conflict or survival-driven urgency. The footage, in that sense, is not dramatic in the way many might expect, but it is revealing in a much deeper way. It shows the beginning of a life that will eventually become one of the most formidable in the deep ocean, yet starts in quiet obscurity. The transformation from this translucent, drifting form into a dense, powerful predator is not something we have observed directly, but the contrast between the juvenile and what we know of adults makes the scale of that transformation clear. It is not just growth in size, but a complete shift in function, behaviour, and presence. The juvenile exists by blending into its environment, by remaining subtle and difficult to detect. The adult, by contrast, becomes something that cannot easily be ignored, even in the darkness. That progression, from near invisibility to undeniable presence, is one of the most striking aspects of its life history, even if it remains largely unobserved. The first sighting, then, does not solve the mystery of the colossal squid. It deepens it. It replaces one set of assumptions with a more complex reality, one where the most powerful version of the animal is only one part of its existence. The rest unfolds in stages that are rarely, if ever, witnessed, each one shaped by the same environment that keeps it hidden. What the camera captured was not the answer, but a glimpse into a process that continues far beyond what we can follow. A reminder that even when we finally see something that has been imagined for so long, what we see is only a fraction of what it truly is. What that brief encounter ultimately revealed was not just how the colossal squid appears at one stage of its life, but how much of that life remains entirely out of reach, because between that fragile juvenile drifting in the dim water and the massive, heavily built adult inferred from remains, there is a transformation no one has ever followed in real time, a progression that must unfold slowly and invisibly across depths that are rarely visited and almost never observed continuously, leaving scientists to reconstruct an entire life cycle from fragments that never quite connect into a complete picture. Because unlike animals that live in accessible environments, where birth, growth, and reproduction can be tracked and studied, this species exists in layers of the ocean that separate each stage of its life so completely that they might as well belong to different worlds. And what we understand about those transitions comes from scattered evidence that has to be interpreted rather than witnessed, creating a situation where even basic questions remain unanswered, not because they are complex in theory, but because there has never been a sustained opportunity to observe the answers directly. and so the life of the colossal squid becomes less a documented process and more an ongoing reconstruction built from rare encounters, accidental discoveries, and comparisons to other cephalopods that may share certain traits but live under very different conditions, which means every assumption carries uncertainty, and every conclusion remains open to revision as new evidence appears, if it appears at all, because the rarity of observation is not just a limitation, it is a defining feature of how this animal is studied, shaping not only what we know, but how we think about what might be missing, starting with the earlier stage of its life, which has never been seen in its natural environment. Because while eggs and hatchlings are a fundamental part of any species, the colossal squid's reproductive behaviour has never been directly observed, leaving scientists to infer details based on related species and the few physical clues that have been found, such as the structure of reproductive organs in preserved specimens, which suggest a method broadly similar to other deep-sea squid, where males transfer packets of sperm to females. But even this basic interaction has never been witnessed, and the location where it takes place remains unknown, raising the possibility that reproduction occurs at specific depths or in particular regions of the Southern Ocean that are even less accessible than the areas where juveniles have occasionally been seen, creating a gap at the very beginning of the life cycle that cannot be filled with direct evidence, only with models that attempt to fit the limited data into a plausible framework. And from that uncertain starting point, the next stage is equally difficult to define, because the transition from hatchling to juvenile must involve a period of growth that is both rapid and vulnerable, where the animal increases in size while avoiding predation in an environment where even small mistakes can be fatal. And yet no one has tracked that growth. No one has followed an individual through those early phases to see how quickly it develops, or what it feeds on, leaving questions about diet, behaviour and survival strategies largely unanswered, even though these details are essential for understanding how such a large predator can exist at all, because the energy requirements alone imply a feeding strategy that must be efficient and consistent. Yet the mechanisms behind that strategy remain hidden along with the animal itself, and as the squid grows, another transition likely occurs, one that may involve a gradual movement into deeper waters, because the few juvenile observations have taken place at shallower depths compared to where adults are believed to reside, suggesting that the species does not occupy a single fixed layer of the ocean throughout its life, but instead shifts vertically as it matures, moving from regions where light is faint but still present into zones of near total darkness and increasing pressure, a progression that would fundamentally change how the animal interacts with its environment, from how it detects prey to how it avoids predators, and yet this shift has never been directly observed. It is inferred from the difference between where juveniles are found and where adult remains are typically associated, creating a picture of a life that is defined by movement through depth rather than across distance, a vertical migration that aligns with the changing needs of the animal as it grows, but remains unconfirmed in its details, leaving open questions about the timing, the triggers, and the exact path of that descent. And when the squid finally reaches its adult form, the uncertainty does not disappear, it simply changes shape. Because even at this stage, where the animal is large enough to leave more substantial evidence behind, most of what is known still comes from indirect sources, particularly from the remains found in the stomachs of sperm whales, which provide insight into size, structure and distribution, but reveal very little about behaviour in a living context, because a squid that has been consumed cannot show how it moved, how it hunted, or how it interacted with others of its kind. And this absence of behavioural observation creates one of the most significant gaps in our understanding, because without seeing the animal alive in its adult state, it is impossible to confirm whether it is an active hunter pursuing prey with bursts of movement, or a more passive predator relying on ambush and minimal energy expenditure, both of which are plausible given the constraints of the deep-sea environment, and while certain anatomical features, such as the powerful hooks and dense musculature, suggest the capacity for forceful interaction, they do not define how often or under what circumstances that force is used. leaving behaviour as one of the most speculative aspects of its biology. And then there is the question of lifespan, another fundamental detail that remains unknown, because without long-term observation or a way to age individuals accurately, scientists cannot determine how long a colossal squid lives, how quickly it reaches maturity, or how often it reproduces, and all of which are critical for understanding not just the species itself, but its role within the larger ecosystem, because an animal of this size must occupy a significant position in the food web, influencing both the populations it preys upon and the predators that target it. Yet without knowing its life cycle, that role can only be approximated, not defined, and even its population size remains uncertain, because the rarity of encounters makes it impossible to estimate how many individuals exist in the vast expanse of the Southern Ocean, leaving open the possibility that it's either more common than we realise but rarely seen, or genuinely scarce, existing in numbers low enough that encounters are statistically unlikely even with modern exploration efforts. And this uncertainty extends to how environmental changes might affect it, because without baseline data on population and behaviour, it is difficult to assess the impact of shifting ocean conditions, such as temperature changes, shifts in prey availability, or alterations in the structure of the deep-sea ecosystem, all of which could influence a species that is already defined by its sensitivity to a very specific set of environmental parameters. And so the life of the colossal squid remains not just partially understood, but fundamentally incomplete as a narrative, a sequence of stages that can be outlined in broad terms but not filled in with the detail that would turn it into a fully observed process. And this incompleteness is not due to a lack of effort or interest, but to the nature of the environment itself, which resists continuous observation and limits the moments when life can be seen directly, turning each encounter into a fragment that must stand in for a much larger unseen reality, a reality where the most important transitions happen without witnesses, and where the story of the animal is written not in continuous footage, but in scattered pieces that only begin to suggest the shape of something far more complex. What begins to emerge from all these fragments is a life shaped less by dominance and more by restraint, because in the depths where the colossal squid exists, survival is not determined by how much energy an animal can expend, but by how little it can afford to waste. And this changes almost every assumption about how such a large predator operates, since the environment itself imposes limits that cannot be ignored, with temperatures hovering just above freezing, often between -1 and 2 degrees Celsius in parts of the Southern Ocean, and pressure increasing steadily with depth to levels that would crush unadapted organisms, creating conditions where metabolism slows, chemical reactions proceed differently, and movement itself becomes something that must be justified rather than taken for granted, turning the body of the colossal squid into a system designed not for speed or constant activity, but for efficiency over long periods of time, where energy is stored, conserved, and used only when necessary, because in a place where food is not consistently abundant and encounters with prey may be infrequent, an organism that relies on constant hunting would simply not survive. And so everything about the squid's biology reflects a different strategy, one that prioritizes patience over pursuit and endurance over bursts of power, even though the capacity for sudden force still exists when required, because the hooks along its arms, the dense musculature of its mantle, and the size of its body all suggest that when it does engage, it can do so with considerable strength. But the key detail is that such engagement is likely rare, carefully timed and highly selective rather than continuous or aggressive in the way surface predators often are, which means that much of its life may be spent in a state of minimal activity, drifting or hovering within the water column, maintaining position with subtle fin movements and slight adjustments, allowing currents to do much of the work that active swimming would otherwise require, reducing the metabolic cost of simply existing in a three-dimensional space where every movement has an energy price attached to it. And this approach aligns with what is known about other deep-sea organisms, many of which exhibit slow growth rates, extended lifespans, and low metabolic demands, all of which contribute to a style of life that is fundamentally different from the faster, more dynamic systems observed in shallower waters. And within this context, the colossal squid's size becomes less about dominance and more about storage, because a larger body can retain energy more effectively, providing a buffer against long periods without feeding, while also supporting the development of specialized tissues that function efficiently under high pressure and low temperature, such as proteins that remain stable despite conditions that would normally disrupt their structure, and cellular mechanisms that maintain function even when external variables shift within a narrow but critical range, ensuring that the animal can operate reliably in an environment where small changes can have significant effects. And this level of adaptation extends to how oxygen is used, because in cold water, oxygen is more readily dissolved, but the demand for it must still be managed carefully, especially in an organism that cannot afford rapid, continuous respiration, suggesting that the squid's circulatory and respiratory systems are tuned to extract and utilize oxygen with maximum efficiency, supporting slow, sustained activity rather than rapid exertion. And this efficiency is also reflected in its likely feeding strategy, which may involve targeting prey that can be captured with minimal effort, possibly relying on ambush or opportunistic encounters rather than active chasing, because the energy cost of pursuit in such an environment would be too high relative to the potential gain, making it more advantageous to wait for the right moment, rather than create it through constant movement. And when that moment arrives, the anatomy of the squid allows for a rapid transition from stillness to action, the arms extending, the hooks engaging, and the prey being secured with a level of force that contrasts sharply with the otherwise subdued nature of its existence, demonstrating that efficiency does not mean weakness, but rather the ability to concentrate power when it is most needed, and then return to a state of conservation once the interaction is complete, minimizing unnecessary expenditure and preserving resources for future use. And this pattern likely defines much of its behavior, creating a rhythm that is slow, deliberate, and largely invisible to any observer not present at exactly the right time, which explains why direct encounters are so rare, because the animal is not constantly moving through its environment in a way that increases the chance of being seen, but instead exists in a more static relationship with its surroundings, blending into the darkness not through camouflage in the traditional sense, but through a lack of activity that makes it difficult to distinguish from the background, especially in a place where light is absent and visual detection depends on contrast and movement rather than colour or detail. And this reinforces the importance of its eyes, which must be capable of detecting the faintest disturbances, allowing it to respond to changes that would otherwise go unnoticed, giving it an advantage in a space where information is limited and every signal matters, whether it indicates the presence of prey or the approach of a predator such as a sperm whale, whose own adaptations allow it to hunt effectively at similar depths, creating a dynamic where both species operate under the same constraints but with different strategies, your one relying on echolocation and active searching, the other on stillness and selective engagement. And the interaction between these approaches defines a part of the deep-sea ecosystem that remains largely unseen, yet is fundamental to understanding how energy flows through these environments. Because even in a place that appears empty, there are relationships and exchanges occurring at scales and frequencies that are difficult to measure, and the colossal squid is part of that system not as a constant presence, but as an intermittent force, appearing in moments of interaction, and then disappearing again into the broader, quieter background, its survival dependent not on continuous activity, but on the precise balance between action and inaction, between taking advantage of opportunities and avoiding unnecessary risk, a balance that is maintained through biological efficiency at every level, from the molecular to the behavioural, creating an organism that is not defined by how often it acts, but by how effectively it does so when it chooses to, and in that sense, its existence is a reflection of the environment itself, a place where survival is not about constant motion, but about understanding when motion is worth the cost. The logic of survival in such an environment leads inevitably to the question of what the colossal squid actually eats, because in a place defined by scarcity, every predator is constrained not just by its own abilities, but by the availability of energy in the system as a whole, and in the Southern Ocean, particularly at depth. That energy is limited, unevenly distributed, and often unpredictable, which means that any organism reaching the size of the colossal squid must rely on a feeding strategy that is both flexible and efficient, capable of taking advantage of whatever opportunities arise without depending on constant access to prey, and the few clues that exist point toward a diet that includes large, slow-moving fish such as Antarctic toothfish, along with other squid and various deep-sea species that inhabit similar layers of the water column, all of which share a common characteristic. They are substantial enough to provide a meaningful return on the energy invested in capturing them, because in this environment, consuming many small prey items would be far less efficient than targeting fewer, larger ones, and this aligns with the anatomy of the squid itself, whose powerful arms and rotating hooks are not designed for delicate handling, but for securing prey that resists, suggesting interactions that are brief but forceful, where success depends on immediate control rather than prolonged pursuit, reinforcing the idea that this is not a predator that chases frequently, but one that waits, positioning itself in a way that maximizes the chance of encountering suitable prey without expending unnecessary energy. And when that encounter occurs, the response must be decisive, because hesitation would allow the prey to escape, wasting both the opportunity and the energy already invested in the attempt. And so the feeding behavior likely consists of long periods of minimal activity, interrupted by short, intense moments of action, creating a pattern that is difficult to observe directly, because it does not produce continuous movement or predictable sequences that can be tracked over time, and this is further complicated by the structure of the deep-sea environment itself, where visibility is limited and the distribution of organisms is patchy, meaning that even if cameras are present, they may not be positioned where interactions occur, leaving most feeding events unrecorded and forcing scientists to infer behavior from indirect evidence, such as the types of prey found in the stomachs of captured specimens or the remains of the squid found within other predators, which together form a partial picture of its role in the ecosystem, one that places it as a significant mid to high-level predator within the Antarctic deep-sea food web, interacting with species that themselves occupy important positions in the transfer of energy from lower trophic levels. And this position is not static, because the squid's own place in the hierarchy shifts depending on its size and stage of life, with juveniles likely feeding on smaller, more abundant organisms, while also being vulnerable to a wider range of predators, and adults transitioning into a role where they're capable of subduing larger prey but are themselves targeted primarily by a smaller number of highly specialized hunters, most notably sperm whales, creating a dynamic where the squid exists both as a predator and as prey, its survival dependent on navigating both aspects effectively. And this dual role highlights the balance that defines deep-sea ecosystems, where even the largest and most formidable species are integrated into a network of interactions that ensures energy continues to flow despite the overall scarcity. And in this context, the colossal squid's feeding strategy can be seen as part of a broader system of efficiency, where each organism is adapted to extract as much value as possible from limited resources, minimizing waste and maximizing return. Because there is no surplus to rely on, no constant abundance to buffer against mistakes, and this shapes not only individual behavior, but the structure of the ecosystem as a whole, leading to a distribution of species that reflects both the availability of energy and the constraints imposed by the environment, with predators like the colossal squid occupying positions that are sustainable within those limits, rather than dominating in a way that would disrupt the balance. And this may explain why, despite its size and capabilities, it does not appear to be overwhelmingly abundant, because the system itself cannot support large numbers of such predators without exceeding the available energy. suggesting that the population is naturally regulated by the same factors that define its behaviour, creating a situation where rarity is not just a result of limited observation, but a fundamental aspect of its existence. And this rarity further complicates the effort to understand its feeding habits, because each piece of evidence is isolated, representing a single event rather than part of a continuous record, requiring careful interpretation to avoid drawing conclusions that may not hold across the broad population. And yet, even within these limitations, certain patterns begin to emerge, pointing toward a predator that is highly specialized for its environment, capable of exploiting specific opportunities while remaining largely invisible outside of those moments. And this invisibility is not simply a matter of depth or darkness, but a consequence of how it interacts with its surroundings. Because by minimizing movement and avoiding unnecessary activity, it reduces the likelihood of detection both by prey and by observers, effectively blending into the structure of the ecosystem in a way that makes it difficult to isolate as a distinct presence. And this has implications for how it is studied, because traditional methods of observation that rely on movement, tracking, or repeated encounters are less effective when applied to an organism that does not behave in ways that produce consistent, observable patterns, requiring alternative approaches that focus on indirect evidence, environmental context, and occasional direct sightings to build a composite understanding of its role. And even then, that understanding remains provisional, subject to change as new data becomes available, because the system itself is dynamic, influenced by factors such as seasonal shifts in productivity, changes in ocean currents, and variations in the distribution of prey species, all of which can alter the conditions under which the squid feeds and survives, making it difficult to define a single fixed behaviour that applies in all situations, and instead suggesting a level of adaptability within the constraints of efficiency, where the squid responds to local conditions in ways that optimise its chances of success without deviating from the underlying strategy that has allowed it to persist in an environment where energy is always limited, and survival depends on making the most of what little is available. What becomes increasingly clear is that the difficulty in understanding the colossal squid is not an isolated problem, but a reflection of something much larger, because the environment it inhabits is part of a vast system that remains, even now, only partially explored. And despite decades of technological progress, most of the deep ocean is still unmapped in any meaningful detail, with estimates suggesting that a significant majority of the seafloor has never been directly observed, and even less of the water column above it has been studied in a continuous or comprehensive way, creating a situation where entire ecosystems exist beyond the reach of regular observation, not because they are inaccessible in theory, but because the scale, cost, and technical challenges involved in exploring them make sustained study extremely difficult. A break time equals 0.5s. And this limitation shapes not only what we know, but how we interpret what little we do see, because without a complete picture, each observation must be placed into a broader context that is, itself, incomplete, leading to interpretations that are necessarily provisional, subject to revision as new data becomes available. And in this sense, the colossal squid is not just an elusive species, but a representative example of how much remains hidden in the deep ocean. A reminder that even large, physically substantial animals can exist with minimal direct observation if the conditions are right. And those conditions are defined by a combination of depth, darkness, pressure, and sheer spatial scale, all of which work together to limit visibility and access, creating an environment where detection is difficult, even when presence is certain. Break time 0.5s. Because knowing that something exists does not mean knowing where it is at any given moment, especially when that something occupies a three-dimensional space that extends for thousands of meters in every direction, with no fixed landmarks or boundaries to constrain movement. And this absence of structure makes it inherently challenging to track organisms over time. Since there are no predictable pathways or points of convergence that can be monitored consistently, forcing researchers to rely on isolated sampling events, remote cameras, and occasional encounters that provide only snapshots rather than continuous records. And these snapshots, while valuable, cannot capture the full range of behaviours or interactions that define a species' life, leaving gaps that are difficult to fill without sustained observation. Break time zoo-5s, which in turn requires resources and technology that are not always available, particularly in remote regions like the Southern Ocean, where harsh weather, ice coverage, and logistical constraints further limit the duration and frequency of research expeditions, reducing the opportunities to collect data and increasing the reliance on indirect methods of study, such as analysing remains, environmental DNA, or the behaviour of other species that interact with the organism in question, all of which can provide important insights, but cannot fully replace direct observation. And this creates a layered understanding of the deep ocean, where some aspects are well documented while others remain largely speculative, and the boundaries between these layers are not always clear, a break time 0.05s, leading to situations where assumptions persist simply because there is no evidence to challenge them, rather than because they have been definitively confirmed. And this is particularly relevant for large animals like the colossal squid, because there is a tendency to assume that size correlates with detectability, that something so large should be easier to find or observe. Yet, the deep ocean challenges this assumption by providing conditions where even large bodies can remain effectively hidden, either by occupying depths that are rarely visited, by moving in ways that minimize detection, or by existing in low densities that reduce the likelihood of encounter. And when these factors combine, they create a scenario where an animal can be both significant in its ecological role and almost invisible in terms of direct observation. Break time equaled IGRA-5s, not existing more as an inference than a continuously observed presence. And this has broader implications for how the deep ocean is understood as a whole, because if a species as large and distinctive as the colossal squid can remain so elusive, it suggests that there may be other organisms, perhaps smaller or less conspicuous, that have yet to be documented entirely. Their existence hinted at only through indirect evidence, or not at all, expanding the scope of what remains unknown, and reinforcing the idea that the deep sea is not a fully charted frontier, but an ongoing area of discovery, where each new observation has the potential to alter existing models and reveal previously unrecognized aspects of the ecosystem. And this potential is not limited to the identification of new species, break time 05s, but extends to understanding processes that occur at scales and depths that are currently underrepresented in scientific data, such as the movement of nutrients, the dynamics of predator-prey interactions, and the ways in which organisms adapt to extreme conditions over evolutionary timescales, all of which are interconnected and contribute to the overall functioning of the ocean as a global system, influencing everything from climate regulation to the distribution of life across different regions. And within this system, the colossal squid occupies a specific niche that is defined not just by its own characteristics, but by its relationship to the broader environment, break time equals ZO5s, making it both a subject of interest in its own right, and a point of entry into a much larger set of questions about how life persists and evolves in one of the most challenging habitats on Earth. And as exploration continues, with advances in technology allowing for deeper, longer, and more detailed observations, it is likely that some of these gaps will begin to close, providing clearer insights into the lives of organisms that have remained largely hidden. Yet even with these advances, the scale of the ocean ensures that complete understanding remains a distant goal, because every new discovery tends to reveal additional layers of complexity, expanding rather than reducing the scope of what remains to be learned. And in that sense, the mystery of the colossal squid is not simply a problem to be solved, but part of a larger narrative about the limits of observation and the ongoing process of discovery that defines the study of the deep ocean, where the unknown is not an absence of information, but a space that continues to challenge and refine our understanding of the natural world. What makes a creature like this persist so strongly in human thought is not simply its size or its rarity, but the way it exists at the edge of what can be known, because long before any confirmed specimen was studied, or any camera captured even a fragment of its life, the idea of something vast and hidden beneath the ocean had already taken shape in human imagination, emerging in stories told by sailors who returned from long voyages with accounts that blurred observation and interpretation, describing encounters with enormous tentacled forms that moved beneath ships, or surfaced briefly before disappearing again, leaving behind impressions that were impossible to verify yet difficult to dismiss entirely. And over time, these accounts became part of a broader narrative, giving rise to the concept of sea monsters, such as the Kraken, break time equals 0.05s, a figure that occupied the same conceptual space that the colossal squid now inhabits, representing the unknown made tangible, a way of giving form to the vastness and unpredictability of the ocean. Because when faced with an environment that could not be fully explored or understood, the human mind filled the gaps with images that reflected both curiosity and unease, creating creatures that were not entirely fictional, but not fully grounded in evidence either, existing in a space between reality and imagination, where fragments of truth were expanded into something larger. And in this sense, the colossal squid can be seen as both a biological entity and a continuation of that long tradition of interpreting the unknown through narrative, except now the process moves in the opposite direction, from myth toward evidence. Break time 05s. As each new discovery refines what was once imagined, replacing exaggeration with detail while still preserving a sense of mystery that cannot be completely removed, because even as more information becomes available, the fundamental conditions that allowed those early stories to emerge remain unchanged, with vast regions of the ocean still beyond regular observation, and many processes occurring out of sight, ensuring that the boundary between what is known and what is possible continues to shift rather than disappear. And this shifting boundary is what sustains curiosity over time, because it creates a space where questions can persist even as answers begin to form, allowing the unknown to remain an active part of how the natural world is understood, rather than something that is gradually eliminated. Break time zoo5s. And this is particularly evident in the case of the colossal squid, where each confirmed detail seems to open additional questions, not because the information is incomplete in isolation, but because it points toward processes and interactions that have yet to be observed, reinforcing the idea that understanding is not a fixed endpoint, but an evolving framework that adapts as new data becomes available. And this has implications beyond the study of a single species, because it reflects a broader pattern in science, where progress often involves recognizing the limits of current knowledge as much as expanding it, acknowledging that uncertainty is not a failure but a necessary component of inquiry, guiding further exploration and preventing conclusions from becoming rigid or disconnected from evidence. And in this context, break time 05s. The presence of organisms that remain partially understood serves an important function, maintaining a sense of openness that encourages continued investigation, ensuring that the process of discovery remains active, rather than settling into a static body of knowledge. And this dynamic can be seen in how public interest responds to such creatures, with each new sighting or study generating renewed attention, not only because of the information it provides, but because of the questions it raises, drawing people into a narrative that is still unfolding, where the outcome is not predetermined and the possibilities remain broad, allowing imagination to coexist with evidence in a way that is both engaging and informative. And this coexistence is not a conflict but a transition. Break time equal Ho5s, where initial interpretations shaped by limited information are gradually replaced by more accurate models, without entirely losing the sense of wonder that motivated them in the first place, because the unknown is not simply reduced as knowledge increases. It is redefined, shifting to new areas and new questions that emerge from the answers already obtained, creating a continuous cycle where curiosity leads to discovery, and discovery leads to further curiosity. And the colossal squid fits into this cycle as a focal point, a species that illustrates how much can remain hidden, even in a world that is increasingly mapped and measured, reminding us that there are still environments where observation is limited and where life unfolds according to patterns that are only partially visible. Break time Eve 0.05s. And this reminder extends beyond the specifics of marine biology, touching on a broader relationship between humans and the natural world, where understanding is always incomplete, and where each new piece of information must be integrated into a larger evolving picture that never fully resolves into certainty, because the scale and complexity of natural systems ensure that there will always be aspects that remain beyond immediate comprehension. And it is within these aspects that both science and imagination continue to operate, not as opposing forces, but as complementary ways of engaging with what is not yet fully known, one providing structure and evidence, the other maintaining the openness that allows new ideas to emerge. And together they create a perspective that is both grounded and expansive, capable of accommodating the presence of creatures like the colossal squid, without reducing them to simple definitions or removing the elements that make them compelling in the first place, allowing the mystery to persist not as an absence of knowledge, but as an active space where understanding continues to develop, shaped by observation, interpretation, and the recognition that even in a world where much has been discovered, there are still depths that have yet to be fully explored, both literally and conceptually. And within those depths, the story of the colossal squid remains ongoing, not as a closed chapter, but as part of a larger narrative that continues to unfold with each new encounter and each new question that follows. The direction this story moves in now is not toward a final answer, but toward the tools that might one day allow those answers to appear on their own, because the barrier between us and the life of the colossal squid has never been a lack of interest or effort. It has always been a limitation of access, a technological boundary that defines how long we can remain at depth, how quietly we can observe, and how much of the environment we can cover without disturbing it. And for most of modern history, that boundary has been restrictive enough that even brief glimpses were rare, leaving entire life cycles to be inferred rather than recorded. Yet, in recent years, that boundary has begun to shift in subtle but important ways, not through a single breakthrough, but through the gradual refinement of multiple systems working together, a break time eq 0.05s. Each one addressing a different aspect of the challenge, from pressure-resistant materials that allow equipment to function reliably at extreme depths, to imaging systems capable of capturing detail in near-total darkness without introducing disruptive light, to autonomous vehicles that can remain submerged for extended periods without direct human control, all of which combine to create the possibility of observation that is not only deeper, but longer and less intrusive than anything that existed before. And it is this combination that matters most, because depth alone does not guarantee discovery. What matters is the ability to remain present in the environment long enough for natural behaviour to unfold, without the constant interference that comes from noise, light, and movement, all of which can alter how animals respond. Break time 05s. Especially in ecosystems where unfamiliar stimuli are rare and potentially threatening, meaning that the very act of observation has historically been a source of disruption, limiting what could be seen even when equipment reached the correct location. And so one of the most significant changes in modern deep-sea exploration is not simply that we can go deeper, but that we can do so more quietly, designing systems that minimize acoustic output, reduce mechanical vibration, and use wavelengths of light that are less likely to be detected by organisms adapted to darkness, creating conditions where observation becomes less of an intrusion and more of a passive presence, allowing animals to behave as they would in the absence of human technology. And this shift is particularly relevant for a species like the colossal squid, break time 05s, whose apparent reliance on minimal movement and low visibility makes it especially sensitive to disturbance, meaning that earlier attempts to observe it may have failed, not only because of its rarity, but because the methods used were too disruptive to capture its natural behaviour. And as these methods improve, the probability of encountering the squid in a way that reflects its actual lifestyle increases. Not because the animal itself has changed, but because the way it is being observed has become more compatible with the conditions it requires to remain undetected. And alongside these improvements in observation, there is also a growing ability to interpret indirect signals from the environment, such as chemical traces, genetic material suspended in the water, and patterns of movement among other species. Break time equals 005s, all of which can provide clues about the presence and activity of organisms that are not directly visible, effectively expanding the range of detection beyond what cameras alone can capture. And when combined with long-duration deployments that can monitor a single area over weeks or even months, these approaches begin to create a more continuous picture of deep-sea life, filling in some of the gaps that have historically limited understanding. And within this evolving framework, the possibility of filming an adult colossal squid alive becomes less speculative and more a matter of time and persistence, because the conditions required for such an encounter are no longer entirely out of reach. They are simply rare, dependent on aligning the right location, the right depth, break time 0.5s, and the right moment with equipment capable of capturing the event without altering it. And while this alignment has not yet occurred in a definitive way, the trajectory of exploration suggests that it is increasingly plausible, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a gradual extension of existing capabilities reaching a point where the probability of success becomes meaningful. And when that moment does arrive, it will not simply confirm what has already been inferred. It will likely reveal aspects of behaviour and interaction that cannot be predicted from anatomy alone, providing context for features that are currently understood only in terms of potential rather than actual use, such as how the hooks are deployed during capture, how the body moves during different types of interaction, break time 05s, and how the animal responds to both prey and potential threats in real time, all of which would transform the current understanding from a static model into a dynamic one, where behaviour is observed rather than assumed. And this transformation would extend beyond the species itself, contributing to a broader understanding of deep-sea ecosystems by clarifying how energy is transferred and how different organisms interact within a system that is still only partially described. And yet, even as these possibilities become more tangible, it is important to recognise that each new discovery will not close the narrative, but expand it, Because the more that is observed, the more complex the system appears, revealing layers of interaction and adaptation that were not previously considered. Break time, row 5s. And this is consistent with the pattern seen in other areas of exploration, where increased access leads not to a final understanding, but to a deeper awareness of how much remains to be learned. And in this sense, the future of studying the colossal squid is not about reaching a point where everything is known, but about continuing to refine and expand the framework through which it is understood, integrating new observations into a model that remains flexible and responsive to change. And this ongoing process is what defines the progression from speculation to evidence, from isolated encounters to a more coherent picture. Even if that picture is never fully complete, because the environment itself resists total comprehension, maintaining a level of complexity that ensures there will always be aspects that remain beyond immediate observation, and it is within that space that the next discoveries will emerge, not as definitive answers, but as new pieces of a larger puzzle that continues to evolve with each advancement in how we explore and observe the world beneath the surface. By the time everything is brought together, what remains most striking is not a single fact about the colossal squid, but the way its entire existence has been assembled from fragments that never fully meet, pieces of evidence that point toward a complete life, yet never quite reveal it all at once. And in that sense, the animal is not just a subject of study, but an example of how knowledge itself is built in places where direct observation is rare, because almost everything understood about it has come from edges rather than encounters, from the marks it leaves on other creatures, from the rare moments when it crosses paths with human activity, and from the environments it inhabits that can be studied even when the animal itself is not present. And when these elements are placed side by side, break time row 5s, they begin to form a shape that feels coherent, a predator adapted to darkness and pressure, equipped with tools that suggest power rather than speed, capable of interacting with some of the largest animals in the ocean. And yet that coherence is always incomplete, always accompanied by the awareness that there are entire aspects of its life that remain unseen, not because they are hidden in a deliberate sense, but because they occur in a part of the world where visibility is limited by conditions that are difficult to overcome. And so the known and the unknown exist together in a kind of balance, where each new piece of information sharpens the outline without filling in every detail. And this balance is what gives the colossal squid its particular place in our understanding of the ocean. Break time 0.05s. Not as a mystery waiting to be solved in a single moment, but as one that persists even as it becomes more defined, because every answer leads to new questions that extend beyond the original focus, touching on broader themes about how life adapts to extreme environments, how ecosystems function when energy is scarce, and how large organisms can exist in spaces that seem, at first glance, too limited to support them. And when considering what has been seen, it is important to recognize how little of it comes from direct, sustained observation. Because even now, most encounters are brief, often involving individuals that are not behaving in a typical way, whether because they are injured, dying, or otherwise outside the conditions that define their normal existence. Break time equals 0.05s. And this means that what has been recorded visually is not always representative of what the animal is like in its natural state, creating a contrast between the image and the inference, between what appears on camera and what must be understood through context. And this contrast is especially clear when comparing the rare footage of juvenile individuals, fragile and almost translucent, with the much more robust, powerful form suggested by adult specimens, and the evidence found in predators that feed on them, because it reveals a transformation that has never been fully observed a growth process that takes place entirely out of view, linking two stages that are known individually but not continuously. And this gap is not a failure of observation, so much as a reflection of the environment itself. Break time 0.05s, where continuity is difficult to capture, because the scale of both space and time works against it, dispersing events across distances and durations that exceed the reach of most studies. And yet even within these limitations, patterns begin to emerge, indicating that the squid is not an anomaly, but part of a system that, while difficult to observe, operates with its own consistency, shaped by the constraints of depth, temperature, and available energy. And it is within this system that the unseen aspects of its life take place. Movements that are likely slow and deliberate, interactions that may be infrequent but significant, and behaviours that are optimised not for visibility but for efficiency and survival, in conditions where excess is not an option. And when viewed in this way, break time 05 was on. The absence of direct observation becomes less of a gap and more of a characteristic of the environment, a reminder that not all ecosystems present themselves in ways that are easy to study, and that some forms of life are defined as much by their inaccessibility as by their physical traits. And this perspective shifts the focus from the idea of uncovering a hidden creature to understanding a hidden context, where the squid is one element among many, each contributing to a larger system that remains only partially described. And in this broader view, the distinction between seen and unseen becomes less absolute, because what is unseen is not necessarily unknown. It is simply understood through different kinds of evidence, through indirect signs and patterns that require interpretation rather than direct observation. Break time 05s. And this is where the story of the colossal squid aligns with a deeper aspect of scientific exploration, where knowledge is not always a matter of witnessing, but of assembling, connecting, and refining ideas based on what can be measured and compared, even when the subject itself remains largely out of sight. And this process does not diminish the sense of mystery. It reshapes it, turning it from something that exists because of ignorance into something that persists alongside understanding, evolving as new information is added without ever being fully resolved. And in the end, what the colossal squid represents is not just a rare and powerful animal, but a reminder of the scale and complexity of the ocean itself, a place where even large, capable predators can live entire lives beyond the reach of routine observation, where the boundaries of knowledge are defined not only by what is discovered, but by what remains difficult to access, and where the act of learning is continuous, extending beyond any single discovery into an ongoing effort to understand a world that is still, in many ways, just beginning to be explored, with each new insight adding depth rather than finality, and each unanswered question maintaining the sense that there is always more below the surface than what has been brought into view.